Hello, my name is Ian, and today we're talking about Heather Shirey and David Todd Lawrence's Creating a Global Archive of COVID-19 Street Art. Um, Heather Shirey is an art historian, but David Todd Lawrence is a folklorist, and it's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this. Street art's a sort of fascinating response because when we think about folk art, when we think about these sort of terms, we're often thinking about first of all, we're often thinking about the things that have historically, at least in the past 100 years, been commodified as folk art, something that's been, from a top down perspective, being classified as a particular realm of human activity, something that can be turned into an example of the folk and their simple crafting ways. So you might think of certain forms of like yard art, whittling, basket making, rug hooking, quilt making, and so on. Genuine, specific human achievements, but in a way, also things that have already been framed as decorative, have already been framed as oriented towards the past. The fetishization of the handmade object, which is not necessarily a bad fetishization to do, but something that is enshrined with that otherness and quaintness and safety, as it were, that it typically gets associated with the things that we call folk when we're talking about folk. But if you expand it, and if you basically go with the fundamental ideas that folk culture is something that is supported by the folk themselves, by the artists themselves, independent of whether it finds a market, independent of whether it finds a patron, then the idea that the artist, the folk performer, is using what is at their disposal to create something, to express something. Whether they do that in words, because we can incorporate that in, but we're specifically talking about material culture. So when we think of things like graffiti and street art, and we can problematize those two terms, because it seems to me that often street art is graffiti that someone has removed from its stigmatized label, and that someone has an authority and a power, and not necessarily the artist themselves. But when we talk about that, we look at graffiti, we look at street art, we have that same idea where they're using the found environments, they're using the walls that are available to them, they're using the materials that are available to them in terms of simple simple cardboard in order to make stencils and spray cans and so on, and basic paint, things that are available easily to create something that is expressive. So Shirey and Lawrence had been doing stuff in the Twin Cities for a number of years, collecting and trying to make sense of how street art affects downtown neighborhoods and the response to gentrification, because they typically have some kind of either explicit or implicit communicative message. And so one of the first things you do when you're trying to establish what these things say is you collect the texts themselves. So their method had been to go out, to document, to create, to talk to artists if they can, but basically to capture images, capture these things in some kind of digital format, because they're also ephemeral. Like much folk art, like much folk practice, it is something that comes up spontaneous. Spontaneous isn't quite the right word, but it comes up. It's imminent. It's reactive. It's a response to the contemporary moment, and as the contemporary moment changes, a new response emerges. So one of the things about street art is that it is often painted over, often by authority, or often by if it's on a piece of private property, by the owner themselves, who had considered it a defacement, or just as often, the next moment requires a new response, and this wall, this place that is chosen because it is situated in a particular place at a particular moment, it can be seen. It is a dais, as it were, for a message. receives a new message. So you have to go out, you're constantly getting these new materials. And then COVID-19 hits. And two things are affected. One, this is, of course, the seismic moment of a seismic moment that people are responding to. Artists have, on one hand, the opportunity of rather abandoned streets. On the other hand, they are exposing themselves to risk for defying stay-at-home orders and exposing themselves to risk potentially by exposing themselves to COVID-19. And the ethnographers, they can't be going out. They can't be doing field trips. They can't be bringing their students and collecting these materials. So they created a digital archive, and they give details about the precise platform. This is an article that's in a journal about art as opposed to a folklore journal. So they're speaking primarily to people who are interested in some of the practical aspects. So there's a database they chose. If I do this project, I'll come back to this article, and I will refer. But basically, they're using best practices in order to. We know that in an ideal universe, we would be going out here and collecting this material ourselves. There are certain aspects of context that we're just not going to be able to pick up, but we can still, nevertheless, create something that will be of use. And why do we create this? Why create these archives? We create them because data is important. And if we go out and we collect, even if we don't have a specific question, specific analytical question, we just go out and we collect and get the data as it lives, then we have resources that we can subsequently come and do the longer grind of addressing these issues. And answering sort of fuller questions. And so that's what they did. They have collected as much COVID material as they could. They used artists' self-submitted photographs. They used, in terms of how they post on platforms, they used news reports. They used and the opportunity for people to submit their own art. And then they're basically able to get a decent representative, although never exhaustive, of course, but a representative sample of how people are using the medium of street art to express something about COVID, whether it is about COVID deniers, whether it is about COVID denial itself, whether it is about oppressive measures, whether it is ascribing blame, whatever. The walls become mediums of expression. It isn't folded into this article, but it's clear that the next seismic event was the George Floyd murder, and Lawrence especially used what they had in terms of, what they had learned in terms of creating the online archive for COVID, and immediately was able to start an online archive for George Floyd themed murals, and a remarkably rich piece of work that is as well. There's a video that's going to be linked in the description that discusses that part of the project in full. But one of the things to think about is that this is Lawrence isn't exactly a public folklorist, but he is using the public folklorist idea of there is something out there that is only of this moment. It is only of this time. And it is something that is not a product of markets and not a product of patrons. It is something that is only going to be generated, and it's only going to exist for this one particular moment. And we will get insight into the nature of art. We will get insight into the nature of vernacular expression if we capture this material. And so we can think back to things like the big projects that were organized after immediately in the wake of September 11th, people going out and collecting and documenting the public art, the public displays, the poetry, the assemblages, the spontaneous shrines, collecting these because folk culture is almost by its definition ephemeral, even with certain forms of materiality where, a piece of material culture allows the ephemeral to exist just for a little bit longer. For the most part, it is going to disappear, and in part because it isn't necessarily meant to last. It is an immediate communication. Sometimes it has permanence, and it's cool when it does have permanence, but that isn't necessarily the impetus for its generation. It's like, this is important now. And so the prerogative is to gather this stuff, to get some sense of it, not to keep it forever, not to subvert the ephemerality of the message, but so that we can see this as part and parcel of the project of human creativity and human genius. B, we can see how that human genius intersected with a specific historical moment. And C, how we can then interpret that historical moment from the vernacular sense, as opposed to from what the powers that be and the media and so on are telling us about this event. So it's a short reading, but it really demonstrates that there is a form of human creativity that needs to be addressed, that falls outside of some forms of contemplation because it disappears, and because it's often associated with issues of like the defacement of public property. And street art is a whole issue in terms of its legality, its illegality, whether, what happens when one artist is allowed control over what should be a public space and imposing their art. But that's a very sort of top-down perspective. But street art has always existed. And it's not a modern phenomenon. It's not an urban phenomenon. It's just often it's within the urban contexts where most opprobrium is sent towards it, because it is disadvantaged voices who often are and angry voices who are often the ones who are wielding the spray can. So anyway, that's basically all I have to say. A nice short article. Watch the explainer video that the parallel video that their university put out. It's a wonderful sort of student-run project, so I recommend it for double reasons. But until that time, or before you do, I will say goodbye to you. My name is Ian, as ever. We have been reading Heather Shirey and David Todd Lawrence's Creating a Global Archive of COVID-19 Street Art. Be well, and I will see you later. Bye-bye.